right? We have a lot to cover today, so I think we'll just get started. Welcome. I'm Kevin Hirano. I'm the Deputy Director for API Vote, and we're very happy to welcome all of you to the April edition of the Voices of the API Community briefing. And we'd like to thank our partners, AAPI Data, the Asian American Journalists Association, for co-hosting with us, as well as NORC and the Associated Press for their ongoing participation. The Voices of API briefings are an incredibly important resource of data and insight into our fast-growing communities, especially during this critical election. And I would also like to say that it also adds to the years-long partnerships we've had, API Vote has had with API Data and Advancing Justice AAJC, putting on our Asian American Voter Survey, which will be coming out in a few short months. Naomi?
Thank you so much, Kevin. Hello, everyone. My name is Naomi Takuyan Underwood. I'm the Executive Director of the Asian American Journalists Association, and our mission is to increase representation of AAPI journalists in newsrooms nationwide, as well as to ensure that AAPI communities and communities of color are represented equitably and accurately in news coverage. And I'm here to introduce the 3 topics surveyed in this month's installment of the survey. And those 3 topics are AAPI outlooks and responses regarding climate change, environmental issues and concern for the environment, as well as AAPI communities' experiences with extreme weather events. And now I'd like to turn it over to Karthik Ramakrishnan, founder and executive director of AAPI Data, to review the major findings of the survey.
Great. Thank you, Naomi, and hi, everybody. As Naomi mentioned, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I'm very excited because API Data has conducted surveys in the past, including several, as Kevin Hirano mentioned, with API Vote and AJC under the banner of the Asian American Voter Survey. And in the past, we've seen that Asian American voters in the AAVS have had strong support on various environmental issues, but we've usually only had 1 or 2 questions in any given survey for us to gain insights into our community. I'm thrilled that with this AP-Norc partnership, we have a lot more insights, and you can find them if you go to the AP-Norc website, and I'll ask one of my colleagues to drop a link in the chat where you can download the report, the top lines, and read additional detail into the findings that we will present today. What we'll present today is not only the charts that you will see in that report, but some deeper dives into our community by factors like ethnicity, like age, and by partisanship to understand how these issues play out in our communities. So let's go to the next slide. So here's some key findings you'll see in the report, and I'll add one to them. So one is that you have about 80% of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders who have been affected by at least one weather extreme event in the last 5 years. 2, about 2/3 say that recent extreme weather events have heavily influenced their views on climate change. Nearly 3/4 are very concerned or extremely concerned about climate change's impact on future generations. This is really important, and hopefully can be part of the conversation we have later. And then next, 7 in 10 believe the US federal government, other high-income countries, and corporations bear significant responsibility for addressing climate change. And then finally, 3/4 believe that in the long run, environmental protection is more important than economic growth. We'll talk about this in terms of the way this question was worded. It's a difficult choice question, and usually we're used to seeing answers closer to 50%. So this gives you a sense of how strong support is for environmental protection in our communities. The last thing I'll say, and it shows up in our findings in the report, is that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are civically engaged already, about on par, and in some cases more so than the rest of the US population. Part of the conversation I'm hoping that we will have today is what can we do to increase that and to make sure that our engagement actually translates into impact when it comes to policies and practices, not only at the governmental level, at the federal, state, and local, but potentially also in the private sector. Let's go to the next slide. So here are some of the findings you'll see in our report. Next slide, please. So first of all, one of the key advantages that we have when we do this work with the Associated Press and NORC is that they have an existing partnership and they have asked survey questions before in terms of public opinion on various matters of climate and environment. And so we're able to compare where AAPI stand compared to the general population, the US adult population. And we see that APIs are more likely to say that climate change is happening vis-a-vis the national average. And then importantly, even though there are some partisan differences that we'll talk about, we see that 2/3 of AAPI Republicans, as opposed to 50% of US Republicans, believe that climate change is happening. Next slide. We also find that APIs overwhelmingly believe that climate change is caused by human activities, more so than the general population. And again, you do see some partisan differences, but it's not dramatic here, right? So you see that, actually, no, I guess there are significant partisan differences, but what you see here is that API Republicans, a majority of them, believe that climate change is caused by human activities, in contrast to the Republican population more generally, where only 31% believe the same thing. Next slide. We also see that API Democrats worry more about the effects of climate change than API Republicans. But similar to what we find elsewhere, API Republicans, more so than the general Republican population, express this worry, as we'll see later on in the deep dives. Next slide. We also have seen, as I mentioned earlier, API adults have taken some kind of civic action in response to climate change. And apologies for the small text here. You'll see the graph in the report and also in the slide deck that we share afterwards. And as I mentioned before, it's about on par with the US population. These differences are not statistically significant, given that you have a margin of error of plus or minus 4.9%. Let's go to the next slide. And then finally, when it comes to not just taking civic action, but even consumer action, if you will, we find that API adults are more likely than the general population to drive an electric car or to have solar panels than the general public. We also see some interesting patterns between those living in California and those not living in California, but that is not a statistically significant difference. But still, you see some hint that where you live might make a difference. But importantly, you have many APIs outside of California also taking these steps. Next slide. The report also shows that almost half of API adults who've driven an electric car or have solar panels have done so to reduce their carbon footprint, right? It's not just because of the convenience or the impetus to save money. It's an intentional action to help the environment or reduce climate change. Next slide. And then finally, when it comes to responsibility, you see greater proportion of APIs say that the US federal government, developed or high-income countries, and corporations bear a significant responsibility for addressing climate change. This is important because often the debate is talked about individual actions that people can take, but we see in our communities is that people see major responsibilities and actions that larger actors, institutional actors need to play, including developed countries as opposed to developing or low-income countries. Next slide. And then finally, we had a question that presents this difficult choice and asks people which comes closer to their view. In the long run, environmental protection is always more important than economic growth, or in the long run, economic growth is always more important than environmental protection. Overall, we see about 3/4 of API adults say that environmental protection is always more important than economic growth. This is pretty astounding. And what is also pretty surprising vis-a-vis what we might expect in the general population is that well over a majority of Republican AAPIs believe that. 58% say that the economy takes priority, the environment takes priority in the long run. Next slide. And then finally, we have opinion on various policies, including reducing greenhouse gas emissions and providing tax credits for solar panel installation. But in the interest of time, I would ask you to refer to the report. So next slide, I believe we should be able to go to the deep dives. Oh, okay. Finally, before we go to the deep dives, Democrats hold an advantage over Republicans when it comes to various matters related to the environment, including, interestingly enough, on energy policy. So that to the extent that energy policy is not just about clean energy, but about energy policy more generally, we see that Democrats hold a significant advantage among API adults vis-a-vis Republicans. Let's go to the next slide. So in terms of some deeper dives, I'm just going to run through a few of these slides to show some interesting patterns. So we've already seen, for example, bipartisanship, whether or not climate change is happening. What's interesting, I assumed or I had expected before collecting this data that we would see a lot of differences by age. But in many of these findings, age does not prove to be important. And that's significant because even though in the general population, we might see greater concern or greater activism among younger folks, we see less of a pattern there. And that's because you see concern so high across the board. So that's important to take a note in our community that if there is an issue where you see a fair amount of consensus across age groups, environment and climate change certainly is one of them. Next slide. In terms of the causes of climate change, we talked before again about some of the partisan differences, but you still have a majority of API Republicans saying that climate change is caused entirely or mostly by human activities. We do see some differences by age here, where with the youngest API adults, much more likely to say that when compared to those age 60 and over, but still you're talking about 60% who say that it's entirely or mostly caused by human activities. Next slide. Terms of how concerned are you about the effects of climate change on you personally? We do see some interesting differences in terms of those who are extremely concerned or very concerned. In terms of, you see that the Filipino American population, it shows the highest levels among Asian ethnicities. You also see that NHPI populations show a higher level of concern in terms of the effects of climate change on them personally. Perhaps not surprising, either in terms of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders that live in the islands, or those who live on the mainland with connection to the islands. That is one of the potential reasons why you're seeing this higher level of concern in terms of the effects of climate change on them personally. Next slide. We do see some partisan differences here, especially when you look at the extremely concerned and very concerned. So about 60% of API Democrats versus about a third of Republican APIs. But if you look at age there, those are not statistically significant differences, similar to what we find elsewhere. Let's go to the next slide. Interestingly, we might have also expected to see some differences by nativity, and we do see them, but they're not large enough to be statistically significant in terms of the concerns about the effects of climate change on you personally. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there'll be a few other findings that I'm just going to pick out. Once we're done with this webinar, we're going to release a slide deck as a PDF through API Vote and on our website at API Data. In terms of concerns about the effects of climate change on low-income people, we do see some ethnicity differences here, as well as racial differences between NHPIs and Asian Americans. Overall, though, you see the vast majority, if they say extremely very concerned or moderately concerned, are expressing concern about the effects of climate change on low-income people. Next slide. We see differences by partisanship here, but not major differences by age. Next slide. And by nativity, we see some differences here, but they're not statistically significant. We do also see some differences by gender. With larger sample sizes, they would break out into statistical significance, very likely, but that's something to note as well in terms of thinking about the effects of climate change on socially vulnerable populations. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of the effects on coastal communities, we do see some ethnic differences. What's interesting here is that if you look at the geography of different Asian populations, Asian Indians are the ones among the big Asian American groups to be the most spread out across the country and potentially less likely to be concentrated in states like California, where concern about coastal communities might be highest. And yet we see that they exhibit among the highest levels of concern about the effects of climate change on coastal communities, indicating that it's not just something personally affecting them or their families, but something that they're worried about in the US more generally. Let's go to the next slide. And then when you look at the effects of climate change on future generations, we see partisan differences here, with Democrats much more likely to be extremely concerned or very concerned. And yet you have a majority of AAPI Republicans that are also extremely concerned and very concerned. We also see some age differences here, but interestingly enough, no differences at all between the very young and those age 60 and over in terms of the concerns about the effects of climate change on future generations. Let's go to the next slide. Finally, and after these slides, I'll just skip to the remainder in the interest of time. But in terms of looking at civic action, we see that that you do have some variation in terms of civic action, like contacting your elected representatives regarding energy and climate policy. Asian Indians more likely than Filipinos, for example, to have done that contacting. So there are some ethnic differences of note here. Let's go to the next slide. Just as a reminder, though, these levels, they might not seem high, but they're on par with the US population. We see that those age 18 to 29 are also more likely to have contacted their elected representatives than those in middle ages. And those who are Democrats are more likely to have contacted their representatives in the last year than Republicans. Let's go to the next slide. In terms of volunteering or donating money to environmental causes, we do see some ethnic differences here, with Asian Indians among those most likely to do so. Let's go to the next slide. Perhaps not surprisingly, we see partisan differences here. Those who self-identify as Democrats much more likely to say that they volunteered or donated money to environmental organizations. And we also see the highest levels among those age 18 to 29. Next slide. Now, there are less formal measures in terms of speaking with friends and family about climate change. And here we see, similarity across Asian ethnicities, but we do see less conversations among NHPIs and potentially room for greater community awareness and education, especially within the friends and family circles, in terms of talking about the effects of climate change in NHPI communities. Let's go to the next slide. We also see pretty high level of engagement in friends and family among the foreign-born. So this was a little bit surprising to me. I would have thought that the native-born would be much more likely than the foreign-born to engage in this. But remember, we have all those other findings too in terms of high level of concern, right, on low-income communities. You also see high level of concern in terms of the international aspects of climate change. So that potentially indicates why you don't see what you might have expected, say, with the native-born population, more likely to speak to friends and family about climate change. Next slide. And then the final thing is in terms of prioritizing economic growth, environmental protection over economic growth. We see support across the board in terms of race as well as ethnicity in AAA and NHBI populations. But there are some differences. So Asian Indians are more likely than Chinese Americans, for example, to prioritize environmental protection over economic growth. Let's go to the next slide. We have some differences by party ID, but not many significant differences by age to note on this measure. So I believe we're at the end. Let's go to the next slide. Let's just go to the next slide, and hopefully we actually, let's skip to the end of the findings in the interest of time, because we have a bunch of other speakers joining us. We will have all of these findings on the API Vote and API Data websites. So thank you so much. And I'm thrilled to welcome Charlene Wang from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, who will give some context about what the EPA is doing and the ways that AAPI communities can get engaged and get involved.
Thank you so much, Kartik. This was a fascinating presentation. Something that really is striking to me in this data is that clearly Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders care deeply about the environment, are concerned about climate change, and yet, so my role here at the Environmental Protection Agency, some of what I've been doing over the last few months is actually reaching out to all sorts of, organizations. These are Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander led community-based organizations to make them aware of some of the grant and technical assistance opportunities that we have here at the EPA. But also hear from them in terms of the issues that they're seeing on the ground related to the environment. And something that has struck me is that even though, clearly our community cares about the environment, a lot of our organizations, and I understand, like they're really focused on like social service delivery, like they're more focused on like the day-to-day of survival rather than being able to shift to the environment. Now, we do have like groups like APEN, for example, that you're going to hear from shortly, but they're few and far between. There is certainly some of that movement happening, I think, especially as climate change becomes a growing concern for our community, but it's, I would say it's early. And I'm not saying that this is our community's fault. You need like capital in order to stand up organizations, but it's certainly something that I noted. And one of the other challenges, which is related to why we don't have these organizations, is we often get overlooked for grants and funding because of the whole model minority myth, right? When, say, a city, for example, is looking at their community, we're having communities that may be doing better off. Portions of our community in a certain city, for example, doing better off, they get merged in with our lower income community members. And as folks on this call probably know, we have some of the highest, inequities we have the highest inequity of any racial, group. I think that came out in a Pew study recently. And so when our communities get merged into one another, unfortunately, our communities do get overlooked for very important funding. And so that's something that we need to challenge the powers that be and do our work in order to get that funding. And the other thing is that because, we have a wonderful organization, again, called APEN that's been focused on environmental issues, but we also do not have at the national level an organization that represents Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander interests as it relates to environmental policy. And so when, say, groups like the White House or, they seek, some sort of group to consult with, that body does not exist. And so why does this matter? It matters a lot. I'm going to name a few of the things that I've learned just through some of my community engagement work. Our communities are being impacted by climate change. Just as an example, I've heard a lot from community-based organizations that there's a lack of, when it comes to natural disaster planning, like when it comes to like FEMA or other governmental bodies, they're not doing a fabulous job of like thinking about our communities. And I apologize if my dog can be heard in the background. But there's not a lot of foresight in terms of like, how do you outreach to especially our non-English speaking communities that need that sort of outreach, especially when it's life or death. In New York, for example, there was Hurricane Ida, and there were 11 individuals that died coming out of that hurricane. 10 out of those 11 individuals were of Asian descent. They were like low income, Asian folks that were basically living in substandard housing. They were living in basement dwellings in New York. Because I don't know if folks know, but Asian Americans actually have basically the highest poverty rate in New York. I know in some years it changes, but in New York City, the Asian American community is incredibly impoverished. On top of that, The New York, in terms of the emergency alerts that came out, they only did them in English and Spanish. They did not include other languages, even though we know that in New York City, almost half of the population of Asians in New York, they're not proficient in English. And so the fact that they did not have these alerts that were in our languages is problematic. I used to work for the New York City government, so I have seen how the default is always English and Spanish, even though it is known as a city of immigrants, and had to push in my own way of doing that. But it's just it's so tragic that these deaths that were preventable happened, because of some government incompetency, right? So that's one thing. We also, because I've been hearing as it relates to extreme heat and the urban heat island effect, that, a lot of our communities don't have access to working air conditioning, or they cannot afford air conditioning. And then as it relates to, just impacts to farmers and fishers there, for example, we have Vietnamese and Cambodian fishers out in the Louisiana Gulf right now that are having such an impact to their livelihood right now because of climate change, exposure to wildfires. We're seeing, Maui, we all saw that play out on the national stage in terms of what a tragic unfolding of what happened there. And so, again, climate change is something that yes, our community is going to be impacted. We can see our community cares, and we've already seen how we've been affected. The other thing that I just want to talk about for a bit too is just around pollution. I work on environmental justice here at the EPA. I have heard some really interesting anecdotes from community-based organizations on the ground, and taking those anecdotes, I've then tried to look up basically what are the existing studies that might back up some of the stuff that we've heard. One overall observation is we often get excluded from environmental health studies, which is unfortunate. But taking, for example, I found myself learning some new things and carrying out this work where I realized I might have internalized some model minority myth things myself too, because I was pretty shocked to see in the studies that do exist, where we are part of a subgroup that is studied in these studies. Basically, there's some surprising things in which we are actually the racial group that is most exposed to certain things. So I'll take, for example, our communities, I heard on the ground are, exposed to basically air pollution by living adjacent to highways, for example. Turns out Asian Americans are actually the racial group that have the greatest likelihood of living within 150 meters to a major highway, which means that that's exposure to all sorts of things. That means, pollutants, carcinogens, all the toxins that comes with living adjacent to a highway. And there's one study that said that Chinese and Korean Americans may have the greatest risk of exposure to hazardous air pollutants. I heard on the ground too from community-based organizations that since our communities tend to live in older apartment units or more substandard housing, we tend to also overcrowd in housing. So we may not be reflected in traditional homelessness data, for example, that actually exposes us to lead. And some of the studies, again, that did actually study Asian American populations, they don't all do that, actually have shown that our communities have the highest level of blood lead levels of all ethnic groups. This was surprising to me to see that. And yeah, it's just, again, lead is obviously something that is incredibly toxic and has long-term implications for, childhood development, all sorts of things. And one of the studies that I had seen was that, actually even across all income groups, Asian Americans stood out as having the highest blood lead levels of all ethnic groups. However, when they broke down all races and, class as well, they did a class and race analysis. Poor Asian kids were the ones of all subgroups that had the highest levels of exposure to lead. So things that challenged even my understanding of how exposed our communities are to some of these environmental justice issues. Um, and you
Charlene,
might
we're
be
actually at time, if you don't mind,
okay.
move on, and we can come back to some of this later.
Okay, will do. I'll wrap it up with my final thing, which is that clearly folks that like our communities are affected, and I'll pass it back to you, Kartik. So appreciate the opportunity to chat about some of the findings here at EPA.
Thank you, Charlene. And some of those, by the way, I learned so much today, including some of those tragic and horrific examples, but also, you know, what happens when we don't have intentional community outreach and language access. So thank you so much. And we look forward to further conversations with you and the EPA on how we can improve, you know, the federal government's understanding with investment in and engagement with our community. So turn it over to Naomi, or ask Naomi to join as she helps lead the next
Yes,
our
thank you so
discussion.
much. Thanks, Karthik, and thank you, Charlene. I think what was striking to me about your remarks was the fact that there is the least data on us and we are the most exposed. That juxtaposition there is really, you know, the heart of why this research initiative is so important. And to move us along the program, I wanted to introduce two important community leaders who are leading this work. One of them being Vivian Huang, co-director of the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, where she is co-director, and she leads in strengthening APEN's organizing and leadership development, advancing strategies for change, and deepening the work of environmental justice in AAPI communities. And second, Paige Tengeluk, the program manager at the Public Health Advocates and member of California's Ocean Protection Council Environmental Justice Advisory Group. That is a mouthful. She was born and raised in Saipan. We just, met each other on the webinar, on the pre-call, and, we're neighbors because I'm from Guam. And I'm pointing that out because of the climate change effects, specifically on Pacifica and Pacific Islander communities. And she identifies as Pacific Islander. She is Palauan. She's active in many environmental justice organizations, including San Joaquin Valley Environmental Justice Steering Committee, as well as various pan-ethnic California-wide organizations. And she's witnessed the effects of environmental impacts firsthand. So we brought you two here together to talk about your work and have an important discussion, especially in response to the data that Karthik reported, as well as some of the insights that Charlene, our EPA speaker, talked about as well. So to lead the conversation, I'd love to hear about, like, as leaders and community experts, what do you see as the most important takeaways from the data that Karthik presented earlier? Vivian, you want to take a crack first?
Sure, I'll start. Thank you so much, Naomi, and Paige, and thank you to everyone in the audience. But again, I work at Asian Pacific Environmental Network. We are the first and largest Asian American environmental justice organization in the country. We organize locally in working class Asian communities, some of whom actually live right next to massive oil refineries in Richmond and Wilmington, others that live near, a maze of highways like Oakland, Chinatown. And I think we've seen over the years that our communities have built vibrant cultural communities, but too often their lives are cut short from the health impacts of having to live alongside big polluters and toxins, right? And so I think that what was really interesting about the poll results is that I think our work over the last 30 years and with a membership base really confirm the poll results. We're seeing very similar trends and attitudes in our communities in thinking about, the impacts of climate change, the concern around climate change, and the need for action, right? And so I think some of the key highlights that really resonated with me, we're seeing how much community members actually care about future generations, how much concern that there is about climate change and its impacts. We run one of the largest multilingual Asian American voter mobilization programs in the nation. We make phone calls and knock on doors and engage with over 40,000 Asian American voters around environmental justice issues each year. And in these different conversations, both with our local bases that we organize, but also with this larger phone bank operation that reaches voters across the state, people repeatedly talk about their support for action around environmental justice. I think the other key highlight and finding is just about how much people believe in the importance of government as a place for agency, for action, for solutions, right? And I think that's really important, is that our communities recognize that it's not about just individual actions that are going to solve the crisis that we're in, but it's actually about the collective action that we want to create for the common good that is actually going to really address this crisis. And the last key highlight that was really resonating with me was just about how the percentages of our communities, that are taking civic action and are getting engaged, and how I think that the role of organizations like APEN, and Paige's organization and other networks that, Charlene referenced, our role is to increase that percentage and to know that more and more of our communities are really experiencing the impacts and experiencing the personal manifestations of what climate looks like in their local communities. And so I think the hope is that we can actually continue to organize in our communities and move more of those folks who really believe strongly in the importance of addressing climate to be more engaged, to be more active, to be more involved, and to really be pushing our government and elected officials to take action.
Thank you, Vivian. Paige?
Yes, I did note a couple of things that kind of caught my attention and stuck with me as well. And so the first is when Karthik showed us the data around age and how he showed that age across the groups, all the groups show the large consensus around environmental issues. And I think for me, as a Pacifica woman, is that, all the things I know and I've learned are from elders, from generations of elders who taught me how to cultivate land, how to protect land, and how to be a part of the larger union of how we are part of that space. And so I remember when I was back in Saipan on the island, I was in 4th grade, and the school actually invested in a program that would launch My Wave. The name of the program was My Wave. And what we did was every day of the week, every selected day of the week, we would go as a class, about 10 minutes of a walk to the beach, and we would clean up trash. And along the beaches were these ritzy hotels that tourists would stay in, live in, etc. And so I remember asking my teacher, like, why do we have to pick up trash? Why is the trash here to begin with? And she would say, oh, it's because they don't know. And when she said they don't know, I asked her, who does not know? Like, it's kind of common sense growing up in my head. Picking up your trash and being respectful of the earth. And so that was the first exposure on the island for me, as like, we are all different people, and it's important to respect space and to leave space how you came and how you showed up in it. And that's what kind of caught me, is that generational knowledge and stewardship that I was blessed with from ancestors really has kept with me, and I've strengthened it over the years in America, living in this country. And then the second point here was Karthik's data on civic action, responding to climate change. And so the specific topic was speaking with friends and family about climate change. And I saw that the NHPI bucket was the smallest percentage of doing that civic action. And for me, I asked myself, why is that? As a Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander, coming to America is a struggle, right? Like the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander community, as of last year, had the largest poverty rate in the US. And I believe the number is every 100, give me a second. So every 22 per 10,000 people face homelessness in the NHPI community in the US, including Hawaii. And so when we think about poverty and other struggles that impact people financially and economically, we are then going to abandon or not keep up with our environmental roots, our environmental practices, because we have to survive to live. And that's really what caught with me. I think, the direction is, how do we strengthen our economic opportunity for people across the board. So we're able to focus on large-scale issues that also impact our island nations, our homelands, etc. So those two topics kind of caught my attention, and I'm going to pass it back to you, Naomi. I don't want to take up more space than with my rambling.
No, we definitely appreciate the personal perspective here. And I wonder too, and Havan posted this in the Q&A, and why do we think Pacific Islanders are less likely to talk about it? And I'm wondering, on the flip side of that, is it because we live it, right? In terms of the Pacific Islander values of like Kuleana, and in Chamorro, it's Inafamalek, right? Is there is an inherent way of living to protect like nature units and ecosystems. But that's just a thought, right? Like that should be further studied as well. But not to take away from your point in terms of there are much more pressing socioeconomic concerns around Pacific Islander communities and households. I'm going to ask two more questions here about, from the perspective of your organizations, right? How do these and you've addressed a little bit about it as well, but how do these findings further affirm or shape the work that you do? Was there anything that, you found insightful that might inform, how you think about something that you're doing strategically or tactically? Can you give some thoughts around that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the poll really confirmed that just overwhelming majorities of Asian Americans are concerned about the impact of climate change and want our government to take meaningful action, right? And I think for us, that means, transitioning away from fossil fuels and investing in climate resilience, things like solar for affordable housing, or making sure that we have resilience hubs, that are central to serve our needs of our people during times of disaster. And I think that what the what the poll just really highlighted for me was around how much people are already experiencing the change, right? The fact that so many high percentages of our communities are already facing extreme heat, already facing, weather related changes, already facing things like flooding. And so I think the poll just confirms that, we do need to figure out a transition, away from fossil fuels. We do need to be investing in climate resilience, and particularly like neighborhood level climate resilience for working class community members, because our communities are the least resourced, to be able to respond. And so I feel like the poll, I mean, I think what's useful about having a poll is because there's such rare data to have kind of national level data polling our communities, particularly around this issue. And it's also very validating to have the poll really confirm and align with what we've been hearing from members, within the areas that we work in California. Yeah, Paige?
Yes, amazing, Vivian. Thank you so much. And I just want to echo Vivian. I think the poll itself and all the data that it showed is very helpful. I think oftentimes in my space here in the Central Valley, we don't have access to data serving organizations. We don't have access to data that we can kind of tear down and really discuss in a group. And I think that's the important piece of having a discussion, having intentional discussion around data and how, this is how our experiences looks like on paper. It's how our experiences look like in numbers. And I think on a personal level, what I've been doing on my own is I'm connecting more with Pacifica community members in the Bay Area who are working on just creating space, right? I think oftentimes we have amazing webinars and meetings and events like this, but our people are working. They're working 10-hour plus jobs, and they can be a part of these amazing conversations. And so it's a matter of like, how do we then, with the data we have, create spaces on the weekends or after school hours or even after work hours to really bridge in community aspect and community voice and bring that back into the whole circle of environmental issues and elevating that. And I think that's the key for me is, like always sharing knowledge and always making it accessible, and having that space be a bit more in layman's terms for the people, if that makes sense. So yeah, I'm for people and making sure that they have access and information to digest that access for sure, and that knowledge.
Thank you both for this, for your answers on this. And there is a question in the chat, but before that, I do want to bring in Karthik because this goes back to what we talked about. Like these statistics are national. There are deeper dives already that are available, and there are much deeper dives. But to go back into the heart of this is really about community capacity and infrastructure. So the question from our anonymous attendee is, what is your perspectives on the value of a national Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander environmental organization, as Charlene mentioned earlier? What do you both believe would need to happen for an organization like that to exist? And just my sort of thoughts on this, it may not necessarily be an organization, right? There are multiple moving pieces to this in terms of the data that's needed to make the case, the policy work, the community organizing work, but would love for the chance to give the chance for you all to respond on, I'll say, national organization or national infrastructure.
Yeah, let me just say two things. I mean, I'll say, so in addition to the survey work that I do, part of my work as a professor is to study policy, including, say, immigration and immigrant rights policy. And you have this kind of classic thing in many things. You have national peak associations and you have state-based work. Both are important, especially when it comes to the environment, given the Supreme Court that we have. And, in ways that the federal government ideally serves as a floor and not a ceiling of what's possible. There's so much important work to be done at the state level, and especially states like California, when it comes to clean air, can set the pace for de facto national standards. So I think it's a both and in terms of what needs to occur. The thing we haven't talked about much, and I think it's so first of all, I actually do think we need to have a peak association in DC. Like if we have a peak association in DC that's focused on healthcare, if we have peak associations that are focused on housing and community development, like why not have that? That is part of what you would expect to see. And when there's a void, and especially when you look at the high level of support, and let's just be honest, given the high level of resources that we have in some aspects of our community, I don't see any reason why we can't do this. But I don't want to let large mainstream philanthropic organizations and environmental organizations off the hook, right? So what is the strategy for NRDC, Sierra Club, and others to have intentional outreach investments and expertise, right? So that you're not only looking to community focused organizations that are only focused on particular communities, but you see that as a core competency for any environmental advocacy organization that is part of those inside the Beltway conversations. Because I think no matter how much you have California-based, Hawaii-based, and other organizations that are doing amazing work, they cannot get immediately to DC if there's like some important meeting where they need to be in person, in the room where it happens, as it were. But would love to hear Vivian's thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think for APEN, we've always been very much rooted in community and have really valued the importance of being rooted in a base. I think so many of the policy solutions that we advance are critically important to working class communities and often differ from some of the more mainstream environmental solutions that are advanced because we are rooted in a base that actually will bring forward, different perspectives, important perspectives, right, that are needed to really understand solutions in an intersectional way. And so I think because of that orientation and value that we have, we've been really committed to growing two different national alliances that represent national alliances of organizations like ours all across the country that are deeply rooted in organizing within a particular community base. So there's, the Climate Justice Alliance that really connects organizations working in environmental justice communities across the country to actually bring that unified perspective and voice to weigh in on national policy, that's related to climate, environmental justice issues. The second alliance that I'm thinking of is Grassroots Asians Rising, which is a national alliance of groups that are organizing in Asian communities all across the country. Even though, many of the organizations do not necessarily focus on environmental climate justice as like their issue area, But what I was mentioning before is that their communities, because they are rooted in communities, they see what's happening in their communities. They're hearing from their community members the concern and the impacts of, climate change. And so I think there's definitely an interest and engagement amongst member organizations to really want to connect, around learning more about these issues. And so I think those are the two national alliances we've really invested in, because we believe really in the importance and power of bring, I think, the perspective, from community member levels to find alignment and kind of synthesis across many of us that are organizing across the country, and to be able to weigh in on different policies and discussions that are happening at the federal level. I think that we also definitely believe in the importance of there's two sets of principles that I want to lift up. One is the principles of environmental justice, and the second one is the Hermes principles. And there's actually been a lot of work done with different environmental organizations that you mentioned, Karthik, like Sierra Club, NRDC, as examples of the importance of, I think, in the work, actually really grounding the work in those principles. And so I definitely believe, there should be more conversation about how we're really centering, I think, communities that are on the front lines of climate change, really making sure that, resources, investments, and funding are supporting the work happening in those communities. Um, and at the same time, I don't want larger, more mainstream groups that aren't connected to those communities to be speaking for those communities. And so I think that's a really just important distinction I wanted to make. And so yes, I definitely believe in the importance of infrastructure and presence and voice and power for our communities when thinking about both, local, state, federal policy. Um, and I think that, some of the ways we've been thinking about it is different than sort of one national entity or organization, but really thinking about being intentional about the approach that we want to make sure that our solutions and our voice, our power is really coming from a grounded and rooted way. Yeah, Paige, I would love to hear your perspectives on this question as well. Given I know there's been so much debate and discussion, even on a global level, right, on how to really center Pacific Islander communities in the discussions happening in a global way because of what people are experiencing right now and are on the front lines of experiencing.
Yeah, and to put it also into context for everyone else, I think we've been talking domestically for the most part, but because Pacifica, it is really in terms of government and policy, it is like both geographically and politically disparate in terms of smaller Pacific Island nations who are much more there's an outsized impact of climate change on Pacific Islander nations, right? And I know there are efforts like the UOG Center for Island Sustainability, and there are sort of groupings of countries working on this. But I just wanted to give a little bit of that background. And Paige, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you. So I learned a lot from Karthik and Vivian's responses. And so thank you so much for that. And I think I follow a lot of like the Pacific leaders and their actions throughout the nation and even in larger spaces like COP28 that took place in Dubai last year, COP28. And from that, they held a large discussion with all the Pacifica leaders, presidents, delegates, etc. And I know they reached an agreement where they are launching what they're calling the Blue Pacific Prosperity Initiative. And what this entails is just the protection of the marine life around the region, as well as funding to support other environmental solutions and maybe technologies to keep that nation resilient. And so after the COP28 summit, they were able to have and implement a new climate protection fund, I believe, costing like $500 million. And I believe the US government is supporting some of that aid. But I think that's what comes to mind for me, right, is, to get work done and to find possible solutions or get started on possible solutions, we need funding. And not just funding, but Karthik mentioned very well, funding that will align with individuals' needs as well as sustainability of the work. And so a lot of times in nonprofit, I worry about my job and I think about, okay, in 3 years, my grant is going to end. So where can I go? On the other hand, we have like funding allocations in like the state, or even not the state, sorry, the nation, that we can allocate annually for investment into environmental justice issues and environmental solutions across the board in the nations that we serve. And so I think of those things. I think of sustainable funding and ethical approaches and how we can better not only ourselves, but those that we serve and those that we impact, like smaller nations. So thank you for asking me.
Well, it's time to wrap. It's about that time, but you know, just to bring it all back to the fact that this survey really provides more foundational underpinnings for the work that organizations that and individual leaders like Paige and Vivian. So, you know, we're thankful that we've been able to come together around Amplify AAPI, and thank you for taking the time to speak about your work and about what's ahead, Paige and Vivian. And thank you always, Karthik, for providing us with the data that underpins the work ahead of us all. I don't think there are any more questions in the chat, but of course you can engage with Team AAPI data. They'll be sure to share the deck as well as contact information. But from here, I will turn it back over to Kevin.
Great. Thank you, Naomi, and thank you to our incredible panelists, and thank you to Karthik. Thank you all for attending this month's edition of our AAPI Community Voices. Our next one we anticipate to be in May. We are hot on analyzing the data. We have a number of things going on. We will keep all of you posted. We will try to disseminate that information to a larger community. But if you have more folks who may be interested in this for our next edition, please go ahead and invite them. But again, thank you all for attending, and have a great day.